Welcome back to the Britannia Coin Company. We're a coin dealer based in Royal Wootton Bassett in the UK. Today we conclude our World War I Wednesdays video series where we've been looking at each of these multi-year sets, each containing 6 silver-proof £5 coins. Today we focus on the 2018 set, again commemorating individuals, events and themes of each of the year of the First World War. The first coin we're going to look at is this one. It's the work of David Cornell and commemorates T E Lawrence, or commonly known as Lawrence of Arabia. The design features a side portrait and to the bottom soldiers on camels. These coins feature edge inscriptions, and on this one reads as "I wrote my will across the sky in stars," from a poem which introduces his book's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, an account of his time fighting in the First World War. He enlisted in the army in 1914 and was posted to Cairo, previously having worked in the region as an archaeologist. He was sent to work with Emir Faisal, the leader of the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. This was supposed to be temporary, with the intention that Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Newcombe would take over on his arrival. Faisal intervened though, keeping Lawrence in place given the work that they'd already accomplished. They worked together for 2 years, leading the Arabs north and eventually capturing Damascus in the final year of the war. Lawrence went on to assist in the Paris Peace Conference as a member of Faisal's delegation, a real advocate of Arab independence. It was in 1918 that his story really began to grab the attention of the public, with Lowell Thomas performing a lecture which over the next 2 years would become more and more focused on Lawrence rather than the campaign. Although there are differing accounts, he took steps away from the limelight, enlisting in the RAF under a false name so as not to draw attention. He went on to work in the Royal Tank Corps in 1923, his cover having been blown in the RAF, although he was able to rejoin them in 1925 after much petitioning by him. He passed away in the May of 1935 in the aftermath of a motorcycle accident in which he swerved to avoid boys on bicycles. One of the doctors attending went on to study the loss of lives of motorcyclists through head injuries and led to the introduction of crash helmets. In 1962 he would be immortalised by Peter O'Toole in his breakthrough role in the British epic film Lawrence of Arabia, based on his own book telling of his time of the First World War. The film was nominated for 10 Oscars and won 7 of them. It was watched by a young Steven Spielberg, who names it as his favourite movie and the film which inspired him to become a filmmaker. Peter O'Toole's portrayal of T E Lawrence went on to be ranked the 10th greatest hero in cinema history by the American Film Institute in 2003. Our second coin commemorates Ypres and is the work of John Bergdahl. It depicts the aftermath of the Battle of Ypres with soldiers by a grave on the roadside. The edge inscription reads, "Here was the world's worst wound," an excerpt from the poem On Passing the New Menin Gate. The Belgian town of Ypres saw some of the most intensive fighting throughout the entire conflict, with 3 major battles including the first use of poison gas in 1917, with fighting from 1914 until the armistice in November of 1918. With Ypres becoming a vital transport hub, it was a town the Allies couldn't afford to lose. It was also one the Germans couldn't allow a breakthrough to their front lines from. The opposing sides had already engaged in the race for the sea, where the Allied forces moved north, attempting to outflank the German forces. This front line stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. It was along this line that many notable battles took place and the stalemate of trench warfare set in. Ypres remains an important place of remembrance of the First World War, with much of it being destroyed by 4 years of heavy artillery strikes. The Ypres salient, an area of territory which extended into the enemy land, thereby being surrounded by 3 sides, has become associated with the phrase Flanders Fields, a phrase popularised by John McCrae's poem of the same name. Our third coin features a look at a tank and is the work of Edwina Ellis. The coin shows a side view of a British World War I tank, and the edge inscription reads as "The devil is coming," allegedly shouted by a German soldier as the first tank entered the battlefield. The concept of what we now call a tank wasn't a new thought, with H.G. Wells writing The Land Ironclads in 1903, imagining the use of armoured vehicles in the battlefield. It was the onset of the deadlocked trench warfare that led British forces to develop tanks in response. Although the word tank is now commonly used, this was a code name for the vehicles which were originally referred to as land ships. 1916 saw the first battlefield deployment of the British Mark I tank in a part of the Battle of the Somme. In their first use they were rather unreliable, with 49 being shipped to the Somme, only 32 able to take part in the offensive and only 9 making it across no man's land to the German lines. However, this highlighted the real potential of these machines in breaking the deadlock, leading to France to create their own tanks and fielding them by 1917, going on to produce more tanks themselves than every other country combined. The German response was only to try and counter the use of this weapon, but ultimately was too late, with only 18 being deployed before the end of the war. The ability to cross no man's land behind thick steel protective armour and crush the barbed wire and other obstacles was much needed in this stalemate, which was claiming increasing lives. It wasn't the most comfortable ride though, with them only moving at walking pace, making a horrendous noise, filling the inside with carbon monoxide and other noxious gases, and reaching temperatures as high as 50 degrees due to poor ventilation. Nevertheless, the tank has become a key component of modern warfare, growing from its roots in this conflict, the First World War. Our next coin is the work of David Rowlands and commemorates the Royal Air Force, or RAF. The design is a World War I biplane in flight with smoke rising in the background. The edge inscription of this coin is "Tumult in the Clouds," from the poem An Irishman Foresees His Death. At the beginning of the war there was the Royal Flying Corps, controlled by the Army, and the Royal Navy Air Service, controlled by the Navy, with their planes underpowered and used mainly for reconnaissance and artillery observation. By 1917 the potential for use of planes as an alternative to break the trench warfare deadlock led to the recommendation that the two services be amalgamated into one independent air service, with this receiving royal assent by the end of November 1917, making it the world's first independent air force, founded in April 1918. As with tanks, World War I became the first large-scale use of aircraft in conflict, although tethered balloons had previously been used in reconnaissance and zeppelins in bombing raids. Initially, air combat was rare, with no weapons for opposing reconnaissance planes to use. Eventually, pilots would throw grenades, grappling hooks, or other items at their opponents. Early armed planes had weapons to the rear, proving useful in combat, but a bit restrictive. The real challenge ahead was to create a front-facing machine gun that could synchronize with the propeller so as to pass through without ricocheting or damaging the propeller. German forces managed to gain air superiority by 1915 with their superior fighter planes, but both Britain and France would begin to field new planes capable of being a match for the German fighters. In 1918, German forces made one last push, with their war with Russia to the east having ended and the losses of air crews on both sides very heavy. Ultimately, by the April, their advance was stalled, in part due to new German fighters not arriving for service. The same fate as tanks, planes and the Air Force became an integral part of warfare, from rudimentary reconnaissance pilots throwing objects at each other to the most advanced fighter jets in service today. Our penultimate coin commemorates women in the workforce and was designed by David Lawrence. The design shows a woman working in a factory producing munitions. The edge inscription is "On her their lives depend," taken from a recruitment poster for women to work in factories. With so many men overseas fighting in the conflict and an increased demand for certain products, almost 1 million women were employed in the munitions factories alone. It wasn't just the manufacturing of critical war supplies though, as other day-to-day jobs needed filling too. Bus drivers, trains drivers, farming, postal workers and delivery drivers, to name but a few. This was not to say that women didn't work prior to the war though, making up a substantial workforce within the textile industries, for example. The war simply opened up more options in previously male-dominated roles. With more women taking up jobs, there was a knock-on effect that more childcare would be needed, leading to the government stepping in and providing day nurseries, which numbered more than 100 by 1917. With increased childcare options, so too did the increase in the amount of women now able to seek employment. As we have mentioned before, there were real strides being made in the areas of women's rights, notably the suffragette movement. Although this was halted at the outbreak of the war, the contribution made by women towards the war effort resulted in even more momentum at the end of the war, with laws beginning to pass at the end of the war to finally grant more rights to women. Another success is something we see growing again in popularity and prestige today, and that is women's football. Seen to be good for morale and health, many factories had women's football teams. For example, Dick Kerr's Ladies FC in Preston, which was founded in 1917 and would draw large crowds. In 1920 they went on to play a French side with a crowd of 25,000 in attendance, marking the first International Women's Association football game. It wouldn't just be the work at home though, as by 1917 the army was running short on men, and it was identified there were plenty of non-combat jobs that if filled by women could free up more men to fight, with volunteers joining the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps to aid the fighting in the field of duty. The final coin in this set, and therefore this series of videos, is this one here, and it commemorates the widows left behind. The designer behind this coin is again WW Lawrence, and it depicts a victory medal resting on a letter with a family portrait in the background. The edge inscription reads, "As the watchers by lonely hearths," from the poem The Cenotaph. With an estimated 3 to 4 million war widows by the end of the conflict, real living symbols of the sacrifices made to preserve freedoms and liberties, with the added factor that strict military policy of the time of non-repatriation of bodies meant there was no gravesides to mourn at in the UK. There were sympathies for these widows, but there was also fear that without a husband these women would be a threat to social order and stability. Prior to the outbreak of the war there was very little support from government for war widows, with a change of pace from the very little financial support from the government and heavy reliance on charitable contributions. By 1916 the Ministry for Pensions was created specifically to deal with war widows and those returning wounded or disabled. However, these pensions came with controls, leaving widows socially and economically vulnerable, expected to honour their fallen husbands, but to be reliant on a new system of support which provided insufficient funds to cover day-to-day needs, leaving them to supplement this income via work, family support or new husbands. Well, there we go, that's the end of this series of videos looking at each of these multi-year releases. It's been fascinating to look at all these designs, and within this set today I would pick the tanks as my favourite design. Let me know what you'd pick as your favourite, but overall I'm going with the gas mask one from the last video. That was my overall favourite one, but I'd be fascinated to know what you guys have picked too. As ever, there are links down in the description to our related products if you'd like to take a look on our website or make a purchase for yourselves. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. It's free to do, it means you won't miss any of our future uploads. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram where we post lots of pictures of coins. We're also on Twitter and TikTok. We've got our shop and online store you can check out, but I'll see you next time for more amazing coins from the Britannia Coin Company.